What's up guys and gals, Aaron here from BikeBandit.com, and today we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of using sliders on your sport bike, along with showing you how to install both frame sliders and rear axle sliders, so stay tuned.
Hey America, today we want to be serving up some sliders, man, over here. We're getting these things nice and ready and hot. We got 3 different types of sliders over here. We got the frame slider, we got the axle slider, and we got the White Castle slider, man. All right, who wants the sliders over here, man?
Steve-O, 2.
All right, man. Hey, you want 2 of these, man? I got you, man. There you go.
Nothing puts a smile on your face like tearing up the streets or the track on your sport bike. But let's face it, on every ride there's always a risk that we could go down. Now we've got helmets, jackets, gloves, and more to protect us when that happens. But what about our bikes? Well, they need some protective gear too. So today we're going to be talking about what you should know when choosing crash protection for your sport bike, and then we'll show you how to install it. First, let's go over the most common form of crash protection for sport bikes: frame sliders. A frame slider is simply a type of puck mounted to the side of your bike to protect the frame in the event of a crash. If you happen to lay your bike down and it goes sliding, the frame slider will protect your frame and engine by sacrificing itself to keep those critical parts off the ground. Because frame sliders jut out from the sides of the bike, you may find that they are actually long enough to keep your fairings from touching the ground too. I found this out a couple years ago when I crashed this bike at the track. When I picked the bike back up, I found out that the Shogun frame sliders I was using were so long, they actually kept the fairings from being damaged even after sliding a considerable distance. Thanks to my sliders, my wreck only cost me a couple $100s rather than thousands. So for me, that was cheap, effective insurance. But while I had a positive experience with sliders, they do have some drawbacks that you should be aware of. When the bike hits the ground in a crash, the slider can direct all the force to the mounting bolt rather than across the whole side of the bike, and your frame can become damaged by that more focused impact. In addition, while they slide great on asphalt, they can also catch on grass or dirt and cause your bike to tumble if it happens to slide off the road. But while these things are possible, in most cases, frame sliders will protect your bike from much more damage than they create. So overall, they're a good investment. Just think of them as cheap insurance against much more expensive damage. In the same category as frame sliders are these axle block sliders from Driven Racing. These are meant to protect your swing arm the same way frame sliders protect your frame. They completely replace your axle block and add this nylon slider to absorb the damage instead of letting your swing arm hit the ground. Now here's something to know. When shopping for swing arm sliders, you'll see some less expensive sliders that replace the spools that mount here. The problem with these is that the bolt that mount the spools to is not nearly thick enough to handle the impact of your bike actually hitting the ground, and the sliders can easily get sheared right off. If this happens, they won't provide any protection at all. I found this out the hard way during my crash, as you can see here. The slider was ripped right off, leaving the rest of the bolt inside the threaded hole where it was mounted. The Driven product is much more robust, so between these and the Shogun frame sliders I had good luck with last time, I should have a good measure of protection for my bike going forward. Okay, with that discussion out of the way, let's get to showing you how to actually install these bad boys. First, let's do the frame sliders. One important thing to note is that I'm going to be using no-cut frame sliders. There are 2 types of frame sliders. One kind juts straight out from the mounting area like this, which would require that you cut a hole in your fairings. The other type are these no-cut sliders, which use an offset to move the puck to a location where no cutting is necessary. Both work great, but know that no cuts are much more popular because most people are not comfortable cutting a hole in perfectly good fairings. Now these Shoguns don't ship with instructions. Instead, they have them available in a PDF download. So print those out first because installation of frame sliders is model specific. Next, we can go ahead and pop off the side fairings to expose the area where we'll mount the sliders. On this bike, we'll be using this engine mount bolt. Now before we start installing, we need to make sure we know which slider gets installed on which side. On this bike, the one with the thicker offset goes on the right and the one with the longer puck goes on the left. Once that's determined, installation is easy. All you do is remove this engine stud with an 8mm hex head socket and then mount the offset in place, replacing the stud with the longer one in the package. Now when you do this, make sure you leave it just loose enough so you can rotate it by hand because you need to test fit it. To do this, just put the fairing on and rotate it until it clears the bodywork without rubbing. When you find the perfect spot, torque it down to OEM spec and reinstall the bodywork. Next, install the puck with a supplied stud and a drop of blue thread locker and torque it down to 32 foot-pounds. Then just repeat for both sides and you're done. Now we'll move over to the axle sliders. These are going to be a direct replacement for the factory axle blocks, so installation is easy. Just pop those out and pop the new Driven ones in. To do this, we'll first get the rear end up on a stand. Next, we'll scoot the chain adjustment screws forward to give us some clearance, then loosen up the axle nut and remove the axle and rear wheel. Then we can pull the factory axle blocks right out. Now we can install the driven axle block sliders. These are made from machined aerospace grade aluminum and come in 4 colors to match your bike, but we went ahead and went with plain black on this one. Just put them in place, reinstall the rear wheel and axle, and tighten the chain adjustment screws as needed. Now is a perfect time to go ahead and check your chain slack while you're at it. Well, that's about all it takes, guys and gals. Getting some crash protection on your sport bike is a pretty straightforward installation, and is a job anyone can take on. Just remember, like I said before, sliders like these won't make your bike crash proof, and really nothing can. But what they can do is give you good, cheap insurance against potentially much more expensive damage. And we think they're better to have on your bike than not. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any feedback or questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments below and we'll respond to you right away. And if you found it helpful, go down to that red subscribe button and hit it. And we'll continue to send you helpful videos just like this one to your inbox every week. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.